Get to the church plant! Get to the church plant! Go! Now!
I'm Pete Mitchell, and he's Peyton Jones, and you're listening to Hardcore Church Planning, the companion podcast for the Church Planner Podcast and Church Planner Magazine. Each week, we'll bring you interviews from planners who are in the trenches making it happen right now. These active church planners bear it all, share their successes, their failures, and what they'd wish they'd known when they were first starting out. Listen in to discover how God is working in their church plant.
You know, when I have a large project at home, sometimes it makes sense to do it by myself. At other times, I actually save money in the long term and have a much better solution if I use an expert. It's really not that much different with church planning. Church planners who focus on building their core team and actually planting the church and partner with portability experts like Portable Church Industries hit the ground running. Yes, you may have to raise more funds up front, but let me tell you something. If I could go back in a time machine and do one thing different in all the churches that I planted, I would go back and have invested that money in Portable Church and all of the super cool kit that they give you to make the volunteers and their lives much, much easier. Trust me, your volunteers will feel invested in, and they're going to give you more of what they got. And that time where people are setting up is going to be a time where it sets the atmosphere for you to thrive. If you're thinking about launching in the next 6 to 36 months, we encourage you to check them out at portablechurch.com.
Hey, church planner, this is Peyton Jones, and you are listening to Hardcore Church Planning. Want to thank you for joining us, especially because our guest today is no stranger at all to the missional movement or church planning in general. And this is Jeff Vanderstel. And we've interviewed Jeff before. He is the author of Saturate and Gospel Fluency, and of course, the founder of Soma Community. So Jeff, welcome on.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here, Peyton.
All right. Well, you know, I have yet to find a person in the world that does not like Jeff Vanderstel. Like you find, you know, it's funny in the church, you always find people bad-mouthing people, which is always bad. But I have yet to hear anybody go, that Jeff Vanderstel guy, I don't like him. There's just something about the way that you portray, just the heart of Jesus, man, for your community that I think everybody connects with. And, sorry to start off right away, just telling you nice things about yourself. You know, I'll pick on you later, I guess, to make up.
That's encouraging anyway. Thank you, Jesus, if that's true.
Yeah. You know, maybe if I go up to Tacoma though and talk to people, they'd be like, oh yeah, that guy. So, you know,
just talk to my missional community. They might give you some thoughts about that.
You know, it's funny. Last time I interviewed you, sorry, there's my train. Only professionalism on Hardcore Church Planning. That was a loud one. So, that's the northbound. That's how you know. If he honks right by me, he's going north. So he's heading up towards you, buddy.
I love it.
Here's the deal. You know, last time I talked to you, your missional community, you and your wife were meeting, I think it was exclusively people that weren't saved, you know, as people that were outside of the faith. And I was super taken by that and inspired by that because that, you know, in a weird way was how I got into church planning, was something very similar in a Starbucks with all unchurched people. So, how's that going these days?
Well, I'm in a different place now. We transitioned from Tacoma now to Bellevue, Redmond area. So started all over again. So I've got a mixture of people that we discipled over the years that moved and joined us, along with some new Christians that some of them have just come to faith, and then people that have not yet come to faith that we're reaching out to. So it's a kind of a mixture of all three groups now, which usually happens as you do this long enough, as you have people that you led to the Lord or that you discipled along the way, and they, you know, want to continue to join you in that. And so some of them even moved with us to join us in this new work up in Bellevue, Redmond area. So
that's rad, man. I think that whole sentiment of starting over is that is so common to apostolic types, church planners, serial church planners, ninjas, whatever you want to call them. But I always relate. There's a song. I hope, Jeff, you're a Foo Fighters fan. I just hope we've gotten that established right away.
I'm there.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So we're speaking the same love language here. We're speaking Foo, and he's got that one song called "Walk," and he says, "Getting good at starting over every time that I return." And I just you say that, and I think, man, that's it. Getting good at starting over, because we're on a mission. It's not. Tell us a little bit about the call that you had from Soma, Tacoma to Doxa.
Yeah, I received a call actually just before the news went public that Mars Hill was going to dissolve as a church, and that each one of the local campuses would become their own church. And I was asked if I would consider coming to the place where Mark Driscoll preached live, which was in Bellevue, and restarting a church, replanting a church. And of course, my first reaction was not a lot of excitement about that idea, though earlier that day God had brought me back to Romans 15, which has been a call passage for my wife and I several times throughout the years of ministry together, where it says, "Those who are strong ought to bear up with the failings of the weak, not to please ourselves, but to please Christ, just as he himself did the same." And so when I read it earlier in the morning and it just kind of jumped out at me, the first question was, "Lord, what's coming?" And so when the call came, it was not really all that surprising. Yet it wasn't very attractive, to be honest. And we entered into a process of fasting and praying. I submitted to all of our elders in Soma, asked them to do the same, and said, "I will not consider this unless you 100% believe I'm supposed to." Which they then took that very serious and said, if Jeff's going to submit to us to that degree, then we have to submit to the Spirit to be willing to open our hands up and say, "Lord, whatever you want." The short version of the story is that God led all of us to be united, that I was supposed to go. That got submitted to about 70 other leaders in our church for a night of prayer and kind of questions, and they all together also affirmed, and then we brought it to the whole church, and the church affirmed with a repentance that came with it, which is really interesting because of some of the hurt that they had experienced, and maybe even gossip and slander they had engaged in, that many people stood up one after another and said, "We believe you're supposed to go, and we need to ask God to forgive us for hearts that have not been loving or gracious towards our brothers and sisters at Mars Hill." And it was a remarkable move, I believe, of the Spirit. And it led to us moving our family north about 45 miles. So it wasn't too far. It was pretty gracious of the Lord to do that to my wife and kids, because we were looking at LA and New York. We were looking at all kinds of places, and to stay close to her family, which is in Seattle and Tacoma, was a nice thing. So yeah, we've been here it'll be 3 years this coming January, but it was 3 years this month that I received the call.
Wow. My goodness. That's crazy, man. That has flown by, eh?
Yeah, it really has.
Wow.
It's been great. I mean, I've had some people meet me, a year or two into it, and they'd say, "How are you doing, man? We're praying for you." Some people even said, like, this is like ministerial suicide, and I'm like, no. When the Lord calls you, He has in store work to be done, and He gets to determine what we do. And so it's been a joy, honestly. The people are amazing. They love the Word. They love Jesus. They want to make disciples. They want to be on mission. That's the beautiful thing that I found, is that there was a great deal of receptivity. I think the majority were eager to follow my leadership, and God granted me a great deal of favor. Of course, not everybody was, but that's any work we ever do. So that's part of the deal. But it's great because we're transitioning a church that large, and I mean, it really is a new plant. We did everything you do in a plant. I just had a huge core group, so that was the difference. But yeah, they are doing well. They're moving forward. It's a great joy. I'm learning a ton, transitioning a church from primarily a Sunday focused event to an everyday mission. And we're still, in the process. I told them it would take at least 3 to 5 years. I think we're going to be looking at it's going to take at least 5 years. But we're on the way. It really is encouraging. So.
I think, man, that, what you're going through up there, first off, I love that kind of what a lot of churches are asking and let's be honest, like, tons of churches are asking, like, how do we transition? Like when I wrote Church Zero, I got a lot of churches going, okay, cool. It was an apologetic. Now tell us how to do team leadership or, like you're actually modeling. And so I don't know if it'll be a future book or what it'll be, but man, I just think people need to study because you're Jeff Stinkin' Vanderstout. You are Mr. Missional Community. Taking this, I know that you didn't change your values. So I think it's going to be really incredible to watch what comes out of this. I think this is going to be almost like pioneering, for a way for others to follow in future. And I'm excited. And we talked before the broadcast about, the fact that we serve a Savior who tells people close to him, one day people will bind you and lead you places you don't want to go. And that's just part of being a servant. That's part of being a minister. I'm sure you didn't wake up one morning and go, hey, you know what I could use in my life? Leading a mega church. And to me, it's just a real, everything was going well for you. It's not like you needed this, that Soma was just, I'm down in San Diego, I know some of your peeps down here, it's things were expanding and going well. And ironically, those are the times that God often calls us out. But you have a new book, and I want to talk about that today. I was on a phone call this morning, and somebody mentioned, Saturate, as kind of an organization that, every person, every place. I'm like, man, if I known that term before I wrote my last book, I would have credited you, but I for sure would have stolen it and credited you. But that is so great. But tell us a little bit about gospel fluency, what it is, why it's important.
Yeah, the idea of gospel fluency is similar to fluency in a language where, if you've ever learned a language, you move from learning vocab and grammar and sentence structure and even culture and how language is shaped by culture. And you get to a place where you don't mechanically think through all those things when you're talking. It just flows out of you. It's like Jesus says, out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. And so when you become fluent in a language, you dream in it, you interpret the world through it, you speak without even doing the translation inside of your head. It just comes out. And the idea with gospel fluency is that the gospel is the word that was spoken and the person of Jesus Christ, who is the word, whereby we were born again. And so it should be above all languages our mother tongue. It's what gave us birth. It's what we should be immersed in a gospel speaking culture. Just like if you were born into another country, you're born into that culture speaking that language. The church is meant to be a gospel fluent people. So when someone comes to faith in Jesus, it was through the gospel, but then they continue to grow up in the gospel. And Ephesians 4:15 says that he says, rather speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into Christ, who is our head. And in verse 21, he describes the truth. He says, the truth is in Jesus. And so the idea is, how do we learn how to speak the truths of Jesus into the everyday stuff of life so that we can grow people up in every way into Christ? That every aspect of life needs to be addressed with the truths of Jesus so that we become fully like Jesus because of his word, the gospel being spoken into it. So it's just helping people to be so fluent that it's what we give people for all of life. And if we can do that within the church, then the mission of the church all of a sudden gets strong, because not only are we growing up in the gospel, but we're fluent enough to speak it to those who don't know Jesus. And I find most Christians don't have a clue how to talk about Jesus in ways that aren't just canned or packaged or kind of, forced, instead of it being out of the overflow of the heart. That's just a normative way of speaking. And so that's really the intent of the book is what is the gospel? Do I believe it? Has it changed me? Is it out of the overflow of my heart that I'm speaking it? What does it look like to create an immersion culture in which we saturate ourselves with the gospel together so that together we all can grow up to become gospel fluent people wherever we're at?
Right. So what was kind of I've listened to so many of the Soma training, I guess you guys would have days where you would get everyone on page, share the vision, the DNA. So I used to listen to your podcasts and, so I feel in many ways like, I've kind of taken a lot in of what you guys are saying, but usually behind a book, there's a story. Was there a time at which you kind of said, people really don't get this, or I'm really seeing a need and there's not really much on this, or what made you want to write this book?
Well, behind every story is usually a personal transformation as well, right? And so I'd have to go back to a very, very difficult time while I was a leader at Willow Creek. I led the student ministries there, and I went through a crisis, significant crisis. And I will point at me for the crisis, not Willow Creek, in that I had not understood how the gospel can set me free from the approval of man. And I found myself in a place where I just was stuck. I couldn't make everybody happy. And thankfully Willow did help us by providing a stipend for counseling. And I was with a gospel-centered counselor, and he just walked me through how the gospel can set me free from the fear of man. And I remember it was like the scales fell off my eyes. It was like I saw something I never saw before, which was my own idolatry and my desperate need for Jesus, not just for my initial conversion, but my ongoing sanctification. And I experienced a radical freedom I'd never experienced before. And of course that, jettisoned me into asking that question of many other things in my life. Where am I not seeing truth? Where am I not looking to Jesus? Where am I not being set free by the gospel? And so I think there's that story behind then planting Soma. And when we started Soma, I just wanted to make sure everybody really understood the massive work God is doing and has done in Christ for all of life. So I think that was already there in the DNA when I started. And then, of course, I got exposure to Keller through the years and watched how he did it so well in his preaching. But then I thought to myself, well, I don't want to have everybody be brought to me because I'm really good at preaching the gospel. I want to figure out how to help them do the very same things that I watched him do and others do. So I just set myself to figure out, what is it that I do? Because I was pretty good at preaching the gospel in every text and applying the gospel. I'm also an evangelist. I've got this apostle evangelist mix. And so I didn't have a hard time having conversations with non-believers. And I kept thinking, how do you translate that? How do I reproduce that? How do I make this transferable? And that to me has been a principle I've fought for in everything I do, which is how can I take what I do in almost intuitive ways and spell it out for someone else who may not do it as intuitively. And I think that's the job of equippers, is that we have to figure that out. So as I wrestled with that and figured I got to make this accessible for normal people, which has been kind of the drum I beat all the time. If a normal everyday person can't get this and reproduce this, then we've got to do some work. Because if the only people doing this are quote unquote professional church leaders or seminarians or whatever, then it's not going to go anywhere. So that's what led to, I think, eventually putting it into training. And then as I did the training, I started getting asked to speak it all over the place. Spoken and did like a 6-hour training that was captured on video at Austin Stone many years ago. And Justin Taylor was there, or somehow got a hold of it and started sending it out everywhere and saying, you guys got to watch this. This is going to help you. And then he came after me and said, we need you to put this into a book. So that's kind of how it all came about. And that's how I got published with Crossway, because that's where Justin is at.
That's rad, man. That what do you call it? That video. I mean, we talked in our first interview. I mean, it's touching. I don't think you can watch that video with a dry eye. And that's kind of, again, going back to what I had said in the beginning was, your heart for the community. And I know you, Jeff, well enough to know that you would put that down to the gospel. You would say that the gospel transformed me first. In fact, your book is really, it starts off the parts of it. I'll just kind of share the breakdown for our audience. First one, it gospel fluency. What is it? Let's talk about it. Then number 2, the gospel, really making sure you understand the gospel. Number 3 is the gospel in me, making sure that you appreciate the gospel and are letting the gospel transform you on a daily basis, like your story right there. And then lastly, the gospel with us, which is the gospel in community. And then lastly, the gospel to others, evangelism. So looking at that, I mean, really, if you want to understand Jeff Vanderstout, you watch that video, you see a guy whose heart is broken over his community. Jeff's going to point you back to the gospel, and that's at the heart of this book. Jeff, what has been some of the real roadblocks to people in the gospel? You mentioned idolatry. You mentioned some of the pitfalls that we hit as ministers. But what are some of the real roadblocks to gospel fluency?
There's so many. I think one of them is there's a spiritual battle going on that we need to take seriously, and so the evil one's going to continue. Not just the evil one, the world, the flesh, all of it. Is going to continue to undermine the truths of Jesus in our lives. Going to call us to question: is it really the power of God for salvation? Is it really sufficient? So I think there's a real spiritual battle. And I think especially when we are about to talk about Jesus in any situation, most Christians that I talk to experience fear, a sense of inadequacy, accusations that they have no business talking about this because look at their life. And that's just attack. And so I think one of it is we got to acknowledge there's a spiritual battle going on, and we've got to be alert to it, and be aware and even engage in how, biblically how we're called to stand against it. But I think the second thing I'd say is that too many people have seen the good news of the gospel as only the starting point of their spirituality, and then they've added moralism and legalism and a whole bunch of other stuff to it. And so, unfortunately, their confidence as they've been in the church longer is less in the gospel and more in programs, systems, spiritual disciplines. I mean, all the practices of Christianity, which are not evil in and of themselves, but when they become a substitute, then we're in trouble. And so I've seen a lot of people hand over to other people something other than the gospel, which is, read your Bible, pray, go to church, give, and which are all great things, but they should be a means to get to the end, which is to get them to Jesus, to reveal their great need for Jesus. And so I think that's the second, is that we tend to exchange the truths of the gospel with something that's very good but not great, and we replace Jesus with other things. So I think that's a tendency in the church. I think the third thing is that most people, if they're honest, are not cultivating a vibrant, passionate walk with Jesus. It's a doctrine they affirm, but not a person that they love. And I know for me, man, I talk about what I love, and when I cultivate my love for Christ and I'm growing in a vibrant relationship with the Holy Spirit, then man, I can't help talking about him. So I think that's a part of it, is like we have to just say, wait a minute, do I even know this Savior? Do I love him? Do I understand what he's done for me? I mean, yesterday, again, one of our other guys was teaching, and I got to just sit back and listen. And I mean, my eyes are just filled up with tears thinking about who Jesus is and what he's done for me. And man, I sing songs and I can't help but be overwhelmed with gratitude. I just think we should check our hearts. I think most of us need a heart check and say, all right, is it even alive to how great Jesus is? So those would be the three big ones, I think. The spiritual attack, the exchanging of the gospel with something lesser for our sanctification. And then I think just our hearts grow cold. And so we talk about what we love, and unfortunately, for most of us, that's probably sports and gadgets and a bunch of other things that are worthless in comparison to Christ.
Right, right. And so it comes back to a heart issue, and it's interesting that so much of what we talk about, the emails that bombard us, the conferences, the promises, that we get through books, it never really has to do with our heart. It's like everything else. No, it wasn't me, Lord. It was this woman you put with me. It was a snake in the garden. Yeah, it was that. That was, that's the ticket. Right. This is not me.
Yeah.
And I love that you go after that, coming from a Reformed background, having been at the doctor's church as the evangelist years and years ago. I mean, one thing the doctor will always do is he'll always bring it back to your heart, and your passion for Jesus. And that's just good, solid gospel. How does Jeff Vanderstout cultivate a relationship with Jesus on a daily basis? What's that look like for you?
Yeah, well, it's both introspective in terms of time alone, solitude, silence, prayer, word, the basic disciplines, and I have to I try to put into place a regular whole day of solitude and silence so that I can let the true doctor, the great physician, examine my heart and do work on me and, help me to mourn and grieve, help me to celebrate and praise, all those things that I think are key to cultivation of our relationship with him. So I think there's that part of it. And then I've found that if I'm not in community with people who can tell me the truth about what they see or can ask me questions about what's going on. And even, my wife is one of the best at that, is just say, Jeff, how's your heart towards Jesus? How's your affection? What's it like? Tell me about what he's showing you and teaching you and how he's leading you and how you're submitting to him. And so it's questions that are very personal in nature about my walk with him. Not just how are you doing, it's how are you in Jesus. So that's been really key, to have a few people who are close to me that can do that. And then being in a missional community, a gospel community on mission, whereby it becomes pretty obvious when your heart gets hardened or your love grows cold, because it shows up in how you relate to people. I mean, your relationship with everybody else is always a reflection of how you relate to the Lord. And because the love that we have for others is always an overflow of the love that we are engaging in with him. So I think those three things are really key: the time alone with the Lord, very intentionally inviting him into examine me, time with a few that really know me and can see my life very closely and intimately, and the time with a little bit larger group that I'm on mission with that can just point out when they see that, yeah, Jeff, your heart's grown cold. We can tell. We know the difference. We know when you're passionately walking with Jesus, and we know when you're not, because it affects all of us. And I think most Christians, unfortunately, are probably not including those three key aspects in a lot of their development. They might do really well at one of them, maybe two, but I think you need all three. And I think you need to be open then to let people speak to you about it.
Yeah, and I think there are people, Jeff, that you bring up a good point. I think there are people that if they're not seeking the Lord, they're probably still pretty cool because they're nice people. And then there's the rest of us, where if we're not walking with Jesus, we're jerks, man. It's just like, I'm by nature a jerk, and so I need Jesus on a regular basis, right, man, where it starts to show. So I am right there with you, man. Hey, the book for everyone is Gospel Fluency. It's by Crossway. You can pick it up everywhere Christian books are sold, including Amazon.com. Jeff, is there a website for this that they can go to, or some way that somewhere you would want to send them to find out? Yeah,
you can go to gospelfluency.com, and that'll give you more information. We also have a larger organization that I started called saturatetheworld.com, which not only has resources for all the stuff we've done, but specifically we've developed a set of videos that goes along with now a guide that we just created, a Gospel Fluency handbook that's coming out any day. And we created a set of videos that accompanies the book and the handbook that people could use in their study. And they're very well done. We had a great team produce those. So that there's more resources if you'd like them.
Okay, well, guys, check those out and check out the book. Jeff, is there any closing comments you would want to give for a church planner just starting out who's heard this and has been moved by it? You've mentioned the importance of walking with Jesus. You've mentioned the importance of having people around you. Is there anything else that you would mention in about 60 seconds or less for a church planner just starting out?
Yeah, I would, for a church planner especially, this is what I tell church planners all the time: you need to do the work of an evangelist. And what that means is you need to constantly be proclaiming the good news of the gospel, assuming it's changing you, assuming you're in community that's shaping you. You need to regularly look for opportunities to share Jesus with people. I prayed whenever I plant a church, I pray, God, give me a daily door that you open through which I can share the gospel. And I looked for it every single day for the first 2 or 3 years of my church planting life. And in some ways, I wish I was still that intent. The downside of having a larger church is you can lose that edge. And so I need to hear the very same thing I'm saying to you. But I would say to you, you have got to ask the Lord to open doors, and you've got to make yourself ready to walk in those doors and pray and pray that God gives you the words appropriately to share Jesus to people. And you got to believe that he's put you in a place where he's already preparing people to hear the good news. That to me is fundamental to planning a church. If you don't believe that, you have no business planning a church. If you believe that, you're just walking into the work that God's already prepared, and you are now going to step into with faith and confidence that not only will he open the door, but the gospel is powerful enough to transform lives.
Right on. Right on, man. Well, thanks for coming on. We have one last question we ask every guest when they come on here, and that is, and it changes every time. The opponents are always different, the contenders. But if you and your British counterpart, Steve Timmis, were to get in a physical fist fight, who would win?
Well, Steve would clearly tell you that he is, because he's a scrapper from the north in England, and but he doesn't know me. I'm a bulldog, man. So I don't give up. I'll probably come away pretty bloody because he's a tough dude, but I don't lose. So I think I'd win.
All right, I'll take it. I'll take it, and yeah, it's I like that tenaciousness. Your secret weapon is stubbornness and tenacity. That'll work. Every church planner needs that quality. Hey, our guest has been Jeff Vanderstelt. The book has been Gospel Fluency. You can go to saturatetheworld.com and gospelfluency.com and find out more. Thanks for joining us today on Hardcore Church Planning, and Arnold, sign us out.
Remember, if you are called to church planting, go hardcore or go home.
You've been listening to Hardcore Church Planning. Hardcore Church Planning has been brought to you by the Church Planner Podcast and the Church Planner Magazine, which is available in the App Store for both Apple and Android devices. If you like this episode, leave us a positive review. If you didn't like this episode, we'll be happy to give you your money back.